The night an 18-year-old vanished into the Blue Ridge, Asheville, North Carolina, January 2nd, 2000. Winter air settles over the Blue Ridge Mountains as an 18-year-old finishes his shift at Walmart and steps unknowingly into one of the most baffling disappearances in Southern history. On this quiet Sunday night, the streets of Asheville glow faintly beneath the cold, pale light of street lamps, the kind of night where most families are inside, doors locked, settling back into routine after the holidays. But for Zebb Quinn, a shy teenager with a gentle nature and big dreams, it's a night that begins like any other. After clocking out, he carries with him a simple plan: meet a coworker, look at a used car, head home. A plan so ordinary, so harmless, that nothing about it seems capable of rewriting the future. Yet as Zebb pulls out of the Walmart parking lot in his small Mazda, the world shifts in a way no one around him can sense. By the time morning arrives, Zebb will not return home. He will not clock in for his next shift, and he will not be seen by his family again. Somewhere along the winding road that cut through Asheville's wooded outskirts, the trail of an 18-year-old boy slips into darkness, and the community is left with a question that has haunted them for more than 2 decades. How could someone vanish so completely, so silently, on a night that promised nothing more than a simple drive under the Blue Ridge sky?
To understand the weight of what happened that night, and the hollow space it carved into the lives of those who loved him, one must first understand who Zebb Quinn truly was, an 18-year-old young man on the fragile edge between adolescence and adulthood, navigating life with the blend of shyness, gentleness, and earnest ambition that made him quietly unforgettable to those who knew him. Zebb was born and raised in Asheville, tucked within the blue-gray slopes of the North Carolina mountains, in a community where neighbors still recognized each other by name, and where families built their futures through steady work and strong roots. Growing up, he carried a softness that stood out in a world quick to reward the bold. He wasn't the sort to command attention when he walked into a room, but rather someone who made people feel at ease simply by being nearby. Friends and classmates described him as polite, humble, and thoughtful, qualities that rarely make headlines but which reveal the true character of a person when the world is not watching. In high school, Zebb wasn't a star athlete or a performer, nor did he seek out the spotlight. Instead, he kept mostly to himself, focused quietly on the things that mattered to him: his family, his close circle of friends, his job, and the future he hoped to build. Those who worked beside him at Walmart spoke of a young man who showed up early, did his tasks without complaint, and treated coworkers with a level of respect far beyond his years. His supervisors saw promise in him. He was dependable, mild-mannered, and steady, a teenager working to earn his own way, saving what he could, and taking pride in the simple reliability of a day's work. Yet underneath that quiet surface was a young man with aspirations that stretched far beyond the aisles of the store. Zebb dreamed of joining the military, a path he believed could open a doorway to purpose, discipline, and opportunity. He had already begun looking seriously into enlistment, and he approached the idea with the same thoughtful determination that shaped much of his life. It wasn't bravado that motivated him, but a desire to challenge himself, to grow, and to serve, a direction that felt right to him in a way he couldn't always articulate out loud. At home, he was a devoted son, close to his mother, Denise, and deeply connected to his family in a way that made his disappearance all the more devastating. Denise often spoke of Zebb's considerate nature, the way he would check in after long shifts, offer help without being asked, and carry himself with a sincerity that felt rare, even for someone his age. He wasn't rebellious, he wasn't drawn to danger, and he wasn't the sort of teenager to stay out without calling. His life had been marked far more by routine and responsibility than by impulsive decisions, and those who loved him knew that he was simply not the kind of young man who would disappear of his own accord. Outside of work and home, Zebb found comfort in the simple pleasures typical of an 18-year-old: spending time with friends, playing video games, watching movies, and navigating the early steps of adulthood in the familiar surroundings of Asheville. He wasn't without challenges. Like any teenager, he experienced moments of uncertainty, shyness, and self-doubt, but those who knew him understood that he faced the world with earnestness rather than recklessness. His future, though still forming, held a sense of hope, a sense of forward momentum. He had goals he was moving toward and people he cared deeply about. He was, by all accounts, a young man with no reason to run, no desire to vanish, and no hidden life pulling him into the shadows. In the final days before he went missing, nothing in Zebb's routine hinted at trouble. There were no warnings, no dramatic shifts in behavior, no signs of distress. He worked his scheduled shifts at Walmart, talked with coworkers, made plans, and interacted with his family in the same gentle, steady way he always had. If anything, he seemed focused on practical matters, like finding an affordable car that could reliably get him to work and eventually support the next phase of his life. The search for that car was what led him to make plans on January 2nd, plans that would take him out into the winter night with a coworker and unknowingly place him on a path from which he would never return. The tragedy of Zebb Quinn's disappearance is not only that it happened, but that it happened to someone like him, a young man who was responsible, hopeful, and grounded, someone who was actively shaping a life built on hard work and quiet perseverance. He wasn't running from anything. He wasn't hiding anything. He was simply living his life, doing the things countless teenagers do every day, building a future that should have stretched decades beyond that January night. When he stepped out of Walmart after his shift, he carried no shadow of fear, no sign of danger. He was thinking about a car, about earning independence, about the next steps of adulthood. And because he was someone who valued routine and responsibility, his sudden disappearance, without warning, without explanation, without a trace, sent a shockwave through his family and the entire Asheville community. Those who knew him best understood instantly that something was terribly wrong. A boy like Zebb did not simply vanish. A boy like Zebb did not walk away from his life. In the decades since he disappeared, the memory of who he was has remained a guiding force for those who continue to search for answers. His story is not defined by the mystery that swallowed him, but by the life he lived before it. A shy, kind, hard-working teenager whose dreams, routines, and relationships paint a picture not of someone destined for disappearance, but of someone who deserved the chance to grow into the man he hoped to become. Understanding Zebb, his character, his hopes, his quiet decency is essential because it underscores the heartbreaking truth at the core of this case. An 18-year-old with everything to look forward to walked into the night and never came home.
On the night of January 2nd, 2000, the events leading to Zebb Quinn's disappearance began with a plan so ordinary, so unremarkable, that almost no one could have imagined it would mark the final known hours of his life. A simple errand involving a used car he hoped to purchase, a step toward greater independence, and a routine act that countless teenagers undertake every day. After finishing his shift at Walmart, Zebb walked out into the cold Asheville night, the post-holiday stillness lingering in the air, the store's fluorescent glow fading behind him as he headed across the parking lot toward his small Mazda. He had spoken with a coworker, 21-year-old Robert Jason Owens, about going to see a car for sale, and they arranged to meet after work to drive together to look at it. This plan was not spontaneous. Zebb had been searching for a reliable vehicle for weeks, something affordable that could handle his commute and give him more mobility as he prepared for adulthood. The idea of purchasing a car was practical, responsible, and entirely consistent with the young man he was, focused, thoughtful, and careful about his decisions. His family later recalled that he had mentioned the search with optimism, viewing this next step as another marker of the life he was building for himself. As he left work around 9 p.m., Zebb seemed his usual self, calm, composed, and ready to follow through on the arranged plan. He met Owens in the parking lot, and the two spoke briefly before setting off in separate vehicles, Owens leading the way in his Ford pickup and Zebb following behind in his Mazda Prodigy. The car they were meant to see was located in the rural area just outside Asheville, and the drive would take them along dark, winding roads,
the kind that threaded through wooded stretches where only occasional houses pierced the darkness. Nothing about the plan seemed remotely risky or unusual. It was simply a coworker helping another coworker look at a potential purchase. There were no arguments, no tension, no signs of anything out of the ordinary between the two young men that night. Zebb had not expressed fear, hesitation, or concern to anyone beforehand. He did not hint at any secret worries or apprehensions. He was doing something normal, expected, and straightforward, meeting a coworker, looking at a car, then heading home. From the moment the two vehicles pulled out of the Walmart parking lot, the record of Zebb's movements begins to form the last verifiable path of his life, a trail that would soon become bewilderingly fragmented. They drove across town and eventually stopped at a gas station on Hendersonville Road, a detail later confirmed through surveillance and witness accounts. What happened during those minutes at the gas station would become a critical part of the timeline, but at this point in the evening, the plan still seemed intact. Owens would later tell investigators that Zebb received a page while they were at the gas station, an event that he claimed altered the night's course, and that Zebb's demeanor shifted quickly after reading it. This moment, which would later be scrutinized extensively by law enforcement, was the first indication that something had changed, though no one at the time recognized it as the pivot point it would become. Outside of that gas station stop, the overarching plan remained unchanged. The two would continue their drive toward the car seller's location. But after that point, what should have been a straightforward errand instead dissolved into a series of events that neither investigators nor Zebb's family would ever fully understand. Zebb, a teenager known for his predictability and responsibility, had begun the evening with a clear intention: to look at a car, and there had been nothing unusual or alarming in the hours leading up to his disappearance. His final confirmed act, leaving the Walmart parking lot to meet Owens, was rooted in the very normalcy that defined his life. His coworkers later remembered that he was in a good mood that night, talking casually about the plan and not expressing even the slightest hint of hesitation. He was simply doing what responsible young adults do, taking steps toward independence. This was the last night anyone would see him alive. And the tragic irony of that fact lies in how unremarkable and predictable the plan truly was. It was not a night out partying, not a meeting with strangers, not a risky or unpredictable excursion. It was a teenager finishing his shift, getting in his car, and following a coworker toward what should have been a routine conversation with a seller. The simplicity of the plan is what makes the darkness of what followed so stark. There was no warning sign, no visible danger, no indication that Zebb was stepping into a moment that would fracture the timeline of his life and leave everyone who knew him searching for answers that seemed perpetually out of reach. Reflecting on this final stretch of verified normalcy, investigators and family members alike have emphasized that Zebb had every reason to return home that night. He had a supportive family, a stable job, and clear aspirations for his future. He was filling his days with steady work, plans for enlistment, and the ordinary steps young adults take as they carve out their path forward. Buying a car was one of those steps, and the fact that it was his focus on the night he vanished only underscores how grounded and forward-looking his mindset was. There was nothing in that plan that hinted at danger, nothing that suggested risk, nothing that should have disrupted the course of a quiet Sunday evening in Asheville. And yet within hours, that plan and the young man who set it in motion would disappear into the cold expanse of a winter night, leaving behind only questions, confusion, and the echo of a routine errand that should have led him safely home.
From the moment Zebb Quinn and Robert Jason Owens left the Walmart parking lot and headed south toward Hendersonville Road, the trail that had begun in the fluorescent brightness of a retail store gradually narrowed into a set of final, haunting sightings that would become the anchor points of the last confirmed moments of Zebb's life. Moments that investigators would revisit again and again as they tried to reconstruct how an ordinary night veered abruptly into mystery. Surveillance footage and witness statements would later place the two vehicles, Owens in his Ford pickup leading, Zebb following close behind in his Mazda Protege, arriving at a gas station along the busy stretch of road, one of the few places still open on a cold January night. Inside the station's glow,
Owens would later tell police that Zebb received a page, a detail that would take on enormous significance in the months and years to come. According to Owens, after checking the message, Zebb suddenly appeared startled, visibly shaken in a way that was completely out of character for the calm, even-tempered teenager his family knew so well. Owens claimed that Zebb urgently told him he had to leave, that something needed his immediate attention, and that their plan to look at the car would have to wait. What happened next only deepened the sense of fracture in the night's timeline. As they left the gas station parking lot, Owens stated that Zebb accelerated abruptly, hitting Owens' truck in what he described as a minor collision, a small dent, a quick impact, a moment that should have been nothing more than an inconvenience, yet which now stands as one of the final, verifiable actions of Zebb's life. According to Owens, Zebb seemed distraught, apologizing quickly, before climbing back into his Mazda and speeding away with a suddenness that made little sense, disappearing into the dark stretch of road ahead in a way that felt panicked, unusual, and completely unlike the reliably composed young man his family and coworkers knew. This account, offered repeatedly by Owens over time, would become a cornerstone of the police timeline, but it also marked the beginning of the inconsistencies and contradictions that would cloud the case. Witnesses at the gas station later confirmed seeing two young men and the vehicles involved, verifying elements of the story, but not the emotional context Owens described. What remained undeniable, however, was that Zebb's vehicle did leave the gas station area abruptly, and that no one who knew him would ever see him again after that moment. Surveillance cameras captured enough to confirm the presence and movement of the vehicles, but not enough to illuminate the reason behind Zebb's sudden shift in behavior. He drove off, alone, into the winter darkness, heading north along Hendersonville Road, and it was during this stretch, this quiet drive of unknowable tension or confusion, that the trail of his confirmed existence fades completely. No other driver recognized his car. No camera captured his next turn. No witness reported seeing his Mazda beyond that final moment of acceleration. For investigators, that sudden disappearance from view marked the dividing line between what could be factually traced and what would forever remain rooted in unanswered questions. Owens later told police that after Zebb sped off, he continued toward the location where they had planned to see the used car, but that Zebb never arrived. He also said that he attempted to search for Zebb briefly before eventually returning home. These details, however, were accompanied by statements Owens gave about his own injuries that night, injuries he later attributed to an unrelated accident that investigators could not fully verify. These shifting accounts and unexplained elements only added to the fog surrounding the case. Still, the last uncontested fact is stark in its simplicity. Zebb drove away from that gas station alone in the final documented movement of his young life. The gas station interaction, brief, ordinary, and yet crucial, became the centerpiece of investigators' efforts to reconstruct the night. It offered the last verified image of Zebb, one that stands in heartbreaking contrast to the mystery that followed. A teenager on a routine errand, suddenly leaving an acquaintance behind, driving into the night with a sense of urgency that no one could fully explain. This moment, which should have been forgettable, now holds a weight it was never meant to bear. It is the last sighting of an 18-year-old whose life had been defined by stability and responsibility, acting in a way that those closest to him could not reconcile with his gentle nature. In the years since, this brief window of time, these minutes at a gas station and the act of driving away has become a focal point for anyone trying to understand how Zebb Quinn could simply vanish. No witness ever came forward with a confirmed sighting of him after that point. No one reported seeing his car driving erratically or parked along the roadside.
There were no calls from Zebb, no signs of distress, no footprints leading away from a stalled vehicle. He was a young man driving down a well-traveled Asheville road. And then, without any observable transition, he slipped into a silence so profound that it has endured. The last confirmed sighting of his life was not accompanied by chaos, danger, or confrontation. It was a simple departure from a gas station parking lot, the kind of moment that happens thousands of times every night across the country. Yet for Zebb, that moment became the edge of an unbroken darkness. This transition from the illuminated space of the gas station to the unrecorded expanse of the night remains the hinge on which the case turns. It is the moment when the known world ends and the unknown begins. And in the cold, quiet air of January 2nd, 2000, the sight of Zebb's Mazda disappearing into the distance became, unknowing to all, the final glimpse anyone would ever have of him.
In the days immediately following Zebb Quinn's disappearance, as his family struggled to understand why he had not come home and coworkers puzzled over his absence from work, a strange and unsettling sequence of messages emerged, communications that only deepened the mystery and introduced new questions about who might have been trying to manipulate the narrative of his movements and why. The first of these came in the form of a voicemail left for Zebb's mother, Denise, sometime after he vanished. The message was brief and poorly recorded, with muffled audio and a tone that suggested a rushed or unsteady voice. Denise later recalled that it did not sound like her son at all. The caller offered no clear explanation, no details, and no attempt to reassure, a rarity for Zebb, who was the kind of teenager who always made sure his mother knew where he was. The voicemail felt foreign, strange, and disconnected from his normal communication patterns. Still, at that early stage, no one could guess whether it was a clue, a misdial, or an intentional intrusion designed to muddy the waters. Days later, another message surfaced, this time not to his home, but to his workplace, Walmart, where an employee received a call saying Zebb would not be coming to work that day. The caller claimed to be Zebb, but those who heard the message or were made aware of it immediately sensed something was wrong. The voice did not match his, and the wording felt unnatural for him. Supervisors quickly grew suspicious, and when investigators examined the situation, they learned that the call had reportedly been made by a coworker who said he was doing Zebb a favor. This coworker stated that Zebb had asked him to call in sick on his behalf, yet that explanation unraveled quickly when those closest to Zebb insisted he would never ask someone else to report his absence, nor would he skip work without legitimate reason, especially without notifying his mother. When law enforcement reviewed the written documentation connected to the workplace message, including notes taken from the call, they found handwriting that multiple people described as inconsistent with Zebb's. This detail, though small, further fueled concern. Zebb had neat, recognizable handwriting, shaped by years of schoolwork and reinforced by his responsible nature. But the writing associated with the call did not carry those familiar traits, leaving investigators to wonder who had actually been attempting to imitate him and what purpose the deception served. The false call added a chilling layer to the unfolding case. Someone had taken deliberate steps to make it appear as though Zebb was still acting of his own volition, still connected to his daily routine, still reachable, when in reality he had not contacted anyone directly since the night he left Walmart. This false message stood out as a rare moment of intentional interference in an otherwise silent trail. For Denise Quinn, these messages were more than administrative inconsistencies. They were emotional blows layered onto the growing terror of not knowing where her son was. She would later say that the voicemail felt hollow and wrong, offering no comfort, no clarity, no sense that her son was simply away temporarily. Instead, it deepened her fear. Everything about the message pointed not toward Zebb's presence, but toward his absence. and the workplace call echoed that same unnatural quality, as though someone was reaching into Zebb's life and tugging at the threads of his routine in a way that felt calculated and disquieting. Yet even with these anomalies, the messages provided no answers, only more questions. They did not lead investigators to Zebb, they did not reveal the motivations behind his disappearance, they did not clarify who made them or what they hoped to accomplish. Police documented both communications, treating them as potential evidence, but with no physical trace linking them to a suspect and no additional messages surfacing afterward, the trail of these attempts at impersonation quickly turned cold. The incoherent voicemail and the false workplace call remain some of the earliest and most tangible indications that someone, somewhere, after the night of January 2nd, took deliberate steps to shape the perception of Zebb's whereabouts, but without any accompanying explanation or confession, they stand as stark, solitary artifacts, pieces of a puzzle that offer no clear path toward the truth. For investigators, these messages represented both opportunity and frustration. They were rare, active signals in a case heavy with silence, yet they offered no decisive direction. For Zebb's family, they were haunting reminders that something unnatural was unfolding, something wholly out of alignment with the young man they loved. Even after months turned into years, the messages remained a disturbing footnote in the case file, referenced repeatedly as evidence of interference but never conclusively tied to any known action or suspect. And because law enforcement adhered strictly to verifiable facts, these communications were only documented as they existed, strange, unexplained, and unconnected to any confirmed lead. What remains clear, however, is that neither message reflected Zebb's voice, his behavior, or his habits. Someone else reached into his life in those early days, someone who tried to mimic his presence after he vanished. And though the intentions behind those attempts remain unknown, their existence marks a pivotal shift in the investigation. The moment when it became evident that Zebb's disappearance was not simply a case of a young man running off or losing contact. These messages signaled something far more unsettling, a silence that someone tried, however imperfectly, to disguise.
As investigators and family members attempted to assemble a clear picture of Zebb Quinn's final hours, the behavior of those around him, particularly the individuals who had contact with him that night or who played a role in the days immediately following his disappearance, became a central focus of scrutiny, not because authorities claimed definitive wrongdoing, but because the accounts, actions, and timelines offered by multiple people seemed to shift, fracture, or contradict one another in ways that deepened the mystery rather than illuminating it. At the center of these complexities was Robert Jason Owens, the coworker who accompanied Zebb on the night he vanished and whose retellings of the evening's events raised questions that would persist for decades. Owens' initial statement to law enforcement followed a basic pattern. He and Zebb had left Walmart together, traveled toward Hendersonville Road, stopped at a gas station, and shortly afterward, Zebb had received a page that abruptly changed his demeanor and prompted him to speed away in distress. But this seemingly straightforward account soon became layered with inconsistencies. Owens initially told investigators that after Zebb drove off, he continued toward the place where the used car was supposed to be. But when Zebb never arrived, he eventually turned around and went home. Later, however, Owens added the detail that he had been involved in an accident that night, an accident so severe, he claimed, that it required medical attention and left him with injuries substantial enough to seek treatment at a local hospital. When questioned about the details of this alleged incident, Owens offered explanations that investigators assessed but struggled to fully verify. The injuries he presented, including reportedly broken ribs and head wound, were scrutinized against the story he told, yet the reported cause, a sudden unrelated crash, did not fully align with the physical evidence available at the time. Simultaneously, co-workers at Walmart who interacted with Owens both before and after Zebb disappeared recalled details that complicated the narrative further. Some described him as nervous or unsettled in the days that followed, while others noted that elements of his retelling seemed to shift subtly each time he spoke about that night. None of these observations constituted proof of wrongdoing, but they contributed to the growing sense among investigators that the story offered by the last known person to see Zebb alive needed careful examination. Compounding this were separate actions by another coworker, who had placed the false call to Walmart saying Zebb would not be coming to work. This coworker, when questioned, insisted he had only been doing Zebb a favor, a claim that rang hollow to those who knew Zebb's reliable habits and his aversion to placing others in awkward positions. The coworker said he received a request to make the call, yet when investigators traced the timeline, they found no corroboration from anyone who had spoken directly to Zebb after the night he vanished. This discrepancy created further confusion about who, if anyone, had instructed the coworker to impersonate Zebb and why. While he was cooperative with authorities, his explanation remained one of several details in the case that felt strangely out of step with Zebb's established behavior. Overlaying these contradictions were additional accounts from acquaintances who interacted with Owens around that time. Some coworkers mentioned that Owens appeared to show injuries or bandages in the days after Zebb vanished, yet his explanation for the timing and cause of those injuries did not always track consistently from one retelling to the next. Investigators also documented that Owens missed a scheduled interview with police in the days after the disappearance, claiming he was hospitalized, which, while supported by medical records, did not conclusively align with the accident narrative he provided. These inconsistencies did not yield definitive proof of involvement, but they created a landscape of shifting information that made it difficult for detectives to establish a clean, uninterrupted chronology of the night. The broader circle of people around Zebb also presented investigators with accounts that were incomplete or fragmented. Several coworkers and acquaintances offered recollections of conversations leading up to that evening, none of which suggested that Zebb was fearful, troubled, or intending to disappear. Yet these same individuals, when questioned about what they knew of Owens or about the circumstances of the planned car purchase, often offered contrasting information. Some claimed they knew nothing about the car, others said they had heard references to it. Inconsistencies in their timelines, memory gaps, and differing impressions of Zebb's interactions with Owens further complicated the overall picture. Still, investigators understood the nature of human memory, particularly in the aftermath of a shocking event, and thus treated these irregularities not as definitive evidence of deception, but as common obstacles in reconstructing an exact sequence of events. Despite that caution, the overall effect of these shifting accounts was a growing narrative instability, an investigation plagued not by a lack of witnesses, but by a lack of consistent testimony. Every time detectives attempted to anchor the timeline to a specific detail, another detail drifted out of alignment. Owens' changing explanations, the false workplace call, the ambiguous voicemail, and the uncertain accounts from coworkers all contributed to an atmosphere in which verifiable facts felt sparse, and the truth seemed buried beneath layers of contradiction. The case did not feature dramatic confrontations, open conflict, or clear-cut motives. Instead, it developed into a tangle of conflicting narratives offered by individuals whose roles ranged from direct involvement in the night's events to peripheral interactions in the days surrounding it. Through all of this, investigators adhered to a careful, fact-based approach, documenting each inconsistency and each revision of events, but drawing no conclusions unsupported by evidence. They noted the discrepancies, tracked emerging patterns, and documented behavior that appeared unusual, yet they did so with the clear understanding that suspicion was not proof and that the absence of clarity did not equal culpability. Still, the lingering effect of these irregular accounts was profound. The more details shifted, the more elusive the truth became. And as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the tangled stories and uneven recollections surrounding Zebb's final night left both investigators and his family facing a troubling reality. The people closest to the events of January 2nd had not given them a clear, reliable narrative. Instead, they had provided shadows shifting impressions, fractured statements, and explanations that raised more questions than they answered.
This web of uncertainty, emerging so early in the case, would cast a long shadow over the investigation, shaping the trajectory of the search for decades to come, and underscoring the deeply unsettling truth that in the aftermath of Zebb Quinn's disappearance, even the people who might have offered clarity instead delivered contradiction.
2 weeks after Zebb Quinn vanished into the winter darkness of Asheville, a discovery was made that would become one of the most unsettling and perplexing elements of the entire case. His Mazda protege, abandoned in the parking lot of the Mission St. Joseph's Hospital emergency room, sitting silently in a place that bore no connection to his habits, his routines, or the plans he had made on the night he disappeared. The car was found on January 16, 2000, by an employee who recognized it from police bulletins and immediately alerted authorities, a moment that reignited hope for answers, but instead opened the door to even more confounding questions. When investigators approached the vehicle, they noted immediately that it appeared deliberately staged, as though someone had gone to great lengths to construct a scene rather than simply leaving the car behind. The doors were locked, the exterior showed no signs of forced entry or damage, and nothing about the vehicle's position in the parking lot suggested it had been abandoned hastily or in distress. But it was what lay inside and around the car that sent chills through both investigators and the family members who would later learn the details. On the dashboard, a plastic bottle had been placed in a way that felt almost intentionally conspicuous, though it had no known connection to Zebb. Near it was a hotel key card, untraceable, unlinked to any place Zebb had ever stayed, and offering no usable lead despite police efforts to track its origin. In the back of the vehicle, investigators found a small live puppy, wandering and frightened, with no explanation for its presence and no connection to Zebb, who had not mentioned adopting or acquiring a dog, nor showed up anywhere with an animal in the days leading to his disappearance. The presence of the puppy baffled investigators and family alike, raising questions that grew only more disturbing when considering the possibility that someone had placed it there intentionally. The dog was unharmed and later taken into safe custody, but its existence inside the vehicle was one of the most bizarre and haunting elements of the case, a detail that had no grounding in Zebb's life and no clear purpose, almost as though it were a deliberate distraction or a symbolic act meant to confuse or mislead. More troubling still was the appearance of the car from the outside. On the rear windshield, drawn in a bright, almost garish shade of pink, was the crude outline of a pair of lips, an image that investigators documented carefully and treated as potential evidence, though its meaning, origin, and relevance remain unknown to this day. The symbol was unfamiliar to Zebb's friends and family, and there was no reason to believe he had placed it there himself. Instead, it appeared to be yet another sign that someone, for reasons unknown, had taken control of Zebb's vehicle after he vanished and had manipulated both its contents and its appearance before leaving it in a public location. Inside the car, investigators found other personal items belonging to Zebb, clothes, belongings, and everyday objects consistent with his life, but nothing that provided clarity about where he had gone or what had happened. What was striking was not the presence of these familiar items, but the contrast between them and the foreign objects that had clearly been added after the vehicle left his possession. The mixture of personal and planted items created an unsettling tableau, one that felt both intimate and carefully constructed, as though someone wanted the car to be found but not easily understood. The vehicle itself showed no signs of mechanical failure, no evidence of a struggle, and no trace of blood or physical conflict. The keys were not left inside, and the car's condition indicated it had been driven without damage or distress. For investigators, this suggested that whoever left it at the hospital parking lot may have done so in a controlled, intentional manner. The location of the car added another layer of perplexity. Mission St. Joseph's Hospital was not a place Zebb frequented, nor was it anywhere near the route he and Owens had reportedly taken on the night he disappeared. It held no known personal significance, and there were no documented medical emergencies involving Zebb around that time. The hospital's parking lot, however, was accessible, public, and frequently monitored, conditions that suggested the person who left the car there might have intended for it to be discovered relatively quickly. Whether this was an attempt to create the illusion that Zebb had been there, or simply a choice of a high-traffic area, remains unknown. When news of the car's discovery reached Zebb's family, hope flickered briefly. Hope that perhaps he had been nearby, or that the car might offer tangible leads. But that hope dissolved into fear as they learned how the vehicle had been found and what was inside it. Nothing about the car's state aligned with the behavior of an 18-year-old who was responsible, careful, and grounded. Instead, the scene suggested manipulation, staging, and an unsettling intrusion into the narrative of his disappearance. The presence of unrelated items made investigators question whether they were meant to distract, mislead, or obscure the truth. There was no logical reason for Zebb's car to contain a hotel keycard linked to no one, a decorative bottle belonging to no one, or a puppy connected to no one. And the pink lips on the window, a detail unusual enough to draw immediate attention, felt almost taunting in their inexplicable placement. Despite thorough examination, fingerprint analysis, and attempts to trace the added items, no meaningful breakthroughs emerged from the vehicle. The puppy offered no breadcrumbs, the keycard revealed no trail, and the bottle provided no forensic value. The car had reappeared, but Zebb had not. The most important piece of physical evidence in the case, the object that should have offered the clearest answers, became instead a symbol of how deliberately and how chillingly the truth had been obscured. The Mazda's discovery marked a turning point in the investigation, the moment when the search for Zebb shifted from a missing person case rooted in hope to a complex puzzle marked by unmistakable signs of human intervention. And as investigators documented the staged scene inside the vehicle, the weight of its implications settled over the case like a shadow, one that would follow every lead, every interview, and every unanswered question for years to come.
When Zebb Quinn's car was discovered abandoned at Mission St. Joseph's Hospital, neatly locked and disturbingly staged with items that bore no connection to his life, the tone of the case shifted dramatically, prompting investigators to broaden their focus and begin building a methodical reconstruction of the hours, days, and weeks surrounding his disappearance. What had started as a missing person report, filed by a mother who knew her son would never vanish without a word, quickly evolved into a complex criminal investigation, one marked by quiet urgency, mounting unease, and a growing awareness that the answers would not come easily. Detectives from the Asheville Police Department began the painstaking task of reassembling Zebb's final known movements, beginning with the moment he clocked out of Walmart on January 2, 2000. They interviewed coworkers, collected time card data, and verified the timeline from multiple angles to ensure no misstep or misinterpretation would cloud the foundation of their inquiry. Surveillance footage from the store and nearby businesses was reviewed frame by frame. Though limited, what remained confirmed the presence of Zebb and Robert Jason Owens leaving the area that night, with Zebb following Owens' truck. The gas station stop, established through both Owens' account and witness statements, became the last confirmed sighting of Zebb, and investigators treated it as a critical pivot point, marking the transition from known facts to the expanse of uncertainty that followed. Investigators also moved swiftly to obtain phone records, reviewing Zebb's pager activity, outgoing and incoming calls, and any communication that might explain the abrupt change in his demeanor reported by Owens. The mysterious page Owens claimed Zebb received that night was scrutinized, and though the number was eventually traced to an acquaintance of Zebb's, the individual in question denied sending the message and provided an alibi that authorities verified. This only complicated the situation further. The page existed, but its origin appeared unintentional,
accidental, or possibly misdialed, yet its impact on the night's events, at least according to Owens, had been immediate and dramatic. The lack of clarity around this key detail became emblematic of the broader case, where facts seemed to fragment into uncertainty the closer investigators came to understanding them. As detectives expanded their interviews, they spoke with dozens of people connected to Zebb: family members, co-workers, classmates, acquaintances, and anyone who might have had contact with him in the days leading up to January 2nd. His mother, Denise, provided what would become some of the most crucial contextual information. Zebb had been stable, responsible, and in good spirits, focused on buying a car and considering a future in the military. There had been no distress, no conflict, no sign of trouble. His friends echoed this sentiment, describing him as reliable and gentle, someone who would never disappear without explanation. The consistency of these accounts reinforced the immediate suspicion that something external, something beyond Zebb's own behavior, had intervened in his life. The discovery of the staged car intensified the search, prompting canvasses of the surrounding hospital grounds, nearby wooded areas, and public spaces. Dogs were brought in to trace potential scents, though the public nature of the parking lot complicated the retrieval of reliable tracks. Search teams combed through roadsides, trails, and remote sections of land outside Asheville where Zebb might have traveled that night, but each effort ended without success. Flyers with Zebb's photograph went up across the city, and local news stations began covering the story, urging the public to share any information. Community members joined the growing concern, as the disappearance of an 18-year-old with no history of instability or risk-taking behavior struck at the heart of Asheville's sense of safety. Investigators also examined the false workplace call left for Walmart, an action that occurred after Zebb vanished and which clearly suggested someone had been attempting to manipulate his schedule or create the illusion that he was still alive and managing his responsibilities. They documented the coworker who placed the call, evaluated his explanation, and assessed the handwriting linked to the message, which was described by colleagues as inconsistent with Zebb's. Though this led to further questioning, the coworker's involvement reached no definitive point of suspicion, yet it remained an unsettling piece of the larger mosaic. Police also conducted multiple interviews with Robert Jason Owens, the last known person to see Zebb. Though he was cooperative at times, his accounts contained inconsistencies, and his report of being hospitalized due to an accident on the night of Zebb's disappearance added another layer to the complexity of the investigation. Medical records confirmed that Owens had received treatment, but the explanations surrounding the injuries did not align cleanly with the rest of the narrative. Detectives documented his statements meticulously, knowing that the details, no matter how small, might later prove critical. As media coverage expanded, tips began pouring in from across the region. People reported potential sightings of Zebb, unusual vehicles, overheard conversations, and suspicious behavior they believed might be connected. Detectives followed each lead diligently, cross-referencing details, conducting interviews, and tracing movements where possible. Yet none of the sightings could be confirmed. None led to a traceable path. None brought investigators closer to Zebb. Still, each tip was recorded and added to the growing case file, evidence of a community searching for answers alongside law enforcement. By the end of the first month, the investigation had grown in scope, complexity, and urgency. What had started as a missing person report, fueled by hope, was now developing into an unsolved disappearance marked by contradictory witness accounts, unexplained messages, staged evidence, and a complete absence of communication from Zebb himself. There were no bank withdrawals, no attempts to access personal accounts, no use of his social security number, and no confirmed sightings. His life, once filled with predictable routines and small hopeful plans, had gone completely silent. Through it all, detectives maintained a steady, methodical approach, cataloging each detail, interviewing and re-interviewing key individuals, preserving the car and its contents, and evaluating every piece of evidence according to strict investigative standards. They remained grounded in verifiable facts, resisting speculation and focusing relentlessly on the tangible threads of information. But as winter stretched into spring, and as the Blue Ridge Mountains cast their long shadows over a community still searching for answers, one truth settled heavily over the investigation. Despite the efforts of police, family, and the public, the case of Zebb Quinn was quickly becoming one of the most confounding disappearances Asheville had ever faced.
In the months that followed the discovery of Zebb Quinn's abandoned Mazda, the investigation entered a stage defined by a frustrating mix of promising leads that seemed to flicker briefly with hope, only to dissolve under scrutiny, leaving detectives and the community grappling with an increasingly complex puzzle and an ever-deepening sense of unease. Tips continued to flood into the Asheville Police Department as residents, moved by the mystery of an 18-year-old vanishing without explanation, reached out with information they believed might help. Some callers reported potential sightings of Zebb across North Carolina, on highways, in shopping centers, at convenience stores, and even in neighboring counties. Yet when investigators followed up, speaking with witnesses, reviewing security footage where available, and comparing descriptions, none of the sightings could be verified. Each reported glimpse of a young man resembling Zebb either lacked corroborating evidence or was proven to be someone else entirely. These false alarms created emotional whiplash for his family, offering brief sparks of hope before inevitably collapsing back into the heavy reality of his ongoing absence. Other tips suggested overheard conversations, rumors circulating in social circles, or vague claims that someone had information but was reluctant to come forward. Detectives examined each of these leads thoroughly, conducting interviews, cross-referencing statements, and attempting to separate misinformation from potential truth. But time after time, the trail would fade into contradiction or reveal no meaningful connection to Zebb's disappearance. Some leads centered around the car discovered at the hospital, with individuals reaching out to say they recognized the unique pink lips drawn on the rear windshield or that they had seen a similar symbol elsewhere. Investigators looked into these claims, exploring whether the symbol could be tied to a particular social group, club, or personal signature, but no consistent or credible link emerged. Others speculated about the presence of the hotel key card found inside the vehicle, prompting police to contact hotels across the region in an effort to match the card to a specific room or guest. Despite these efforts, the key card could not be traced to any location that had documented involvement with Zebb, nor did it connect to any known associate. The plastic bottle found inside the Mazda generated its own wave of calls, with people suggesting possible origins, but it too offered no actionable answers. Even the unexpected presence of the puppy yielded no developments. Although the dog was examined and cared for, no owner came forward claiming to have lost it, and no one could explain how it had ended up inside Zebb's car. Investigators also received accounts from acquaintances and distant contacts who believed they had information about Zebb's mental state, relationships, or activities before he disappeared. These secondhand narratives often conflicted with one another, and most contradicted the consistent testimony of those closest to Zebb, family members and friends who unanimously described him as stable, motivated, and focused on his future. Detectives sifted through these claims with careful attention, but none provided a factual basis for establishing motive, circumstance, or direction. Some leads drew investigators back to the rural areas surrounding Asheville, prompting additional searches of remote land, wooded trails, and secluded properties. These searches, often assisted by volunteers and cadaver dogs, were conducted methodically and respectfully, yet none produced evidence of Zebb or his belongings. Each unsuccessful effort contributed to an expanding sense of frustration, as though the case were surrounded not by silence alone, but by a kind of invisible resistance, an inability to penetrate the truth. One of the most significant early avenues of inquiry involved re-examining the events of January 2nd through the lens of newly gathered information, cross-checking each timeline against witness accounts. However, the inconsistencies present in the statements of certain individuals, particularly those who had been with or around Zebb before he vanished, continued to create obstacles. Detectives attempted to reconcile these contradictions, but the more they worked to align the stories, the more the discrepancies stood out. Small details, such as exact times, descriptions of Zebb's reaction at the gas station, or the nature of subsequent communication, conflicted across interviews, creating a patchwork timeline riddled with gaps. Despite this, investigators could only work with verified facts, and the lack of conclusive physical evidence meant that many leads, especially those based on speculation or memory rather than documentation, could not be confidently pursued further. Multiple early leads involved potential connections to distant acquaintances or individuals on the periphery of Zebb's life. Some callers suggested jealousy, conflict, or hidden tensions, while others speculated about disputes or misunderstandings at work. Investigators followed each suggestion carefully, interviewing those named, reviewing workplace dynamics, and analyzing social connections, but all such inquiries returned the same result. No one could identify a legitimate threat in Zebb's life. His world was small, stable, and grounded in routine: work, home, a close but modest social circle. There were no documented conflicts, no financial issues, no romantic entanglements that suggested volatility, and no known disputes that might hint at motive. These facts made the disappearance all the more confounding. For investigators, the growing file of dead ends painted a picture not of a young man who had intended to leave, but of one whose ordinary life had been interrupted by forces completely outside his control. At several points in the investigation, detectives attempted to retrace Zebb's potential route after leaving the gas station, analyzing traffic patterns, road access points, and possible destinations. They considered whether he could have driven off course, whether an accident might have occurred in an unlit or remote area, or whether someone else could have intervened. Yet extensive searches yielded nothing: no vehicle debris, no tire marks, no physical remnants suggesting that Zebb's Mazda had been in distress before being placed at the hospital weeks later. This absence of evidence became its own haunting marker. If something had happened along the road that night, it left no trace that investigators could uncover. And if something had happened elsewhere, it was hidden with equal thoroughness. As winter turned to spring, the initial rush of tips slowed. The leads that had once arrived daily began to taper, and the pattern of the investigation settled into a painful cycle. New information would surface. Detectives would examine it with diligence, and inevitably it would dissolve, leaving the same unanswered questions in its wake. The early leads had provided direction, but none had provided truth. And with each dead end, the weight of the case grew heavier, not just for investigators, but for Zebb's loved ones, who watched as every hopeful spark dimmed and disappeared, just as he had on that winter night.
Years passed with little movement in the disappearance of Zebb Quinn, and Asheville's most haunting unsolved mystery remained frozen in place, until a shocking development in 2015 thrust the case back into the public eye and brought renewed scrutiny to the man long considered central to the last known hours of Zebb's life. In March of that year, 15 years after Zebb vanished, Robert Jason Owens, Zebb's coworker and the last confirmed person to see him alive, was arrested and later convicted in connection with one of the most disturbing criminal cases in modern North Carolina history: the disappearance and murder of the Codd family near Leicester. The victims, Joseph J.T. Codd and his wife, Christy Shone Codd, were well known and respected in the community, with Christy having gained national visibility through her appearance on a cooking television competition. When the Codds suddenly went missing, a massive search effort unfolded and investigators soon uncovered evidence that led directly to Owens. Authorities ultimately charged him with multiple counts, including first-degree murder, dismembering human remains, and fraudulent activity involving the couple's property. Owens later accepted a plea agreement, admitting responsibility for the killings, and was sentenced to multiple decades in prison. The brutality and deliberateness of the crime stunned the region and reignited public awareness of Owens, an awareness that linked back unmistakably to the night Zebb Quinn disappeared. As news of the Codd murder spread, media outlets and investigators alike revisited the Quinn case, examining the previously unresolved questions surrounding Owens' involvement on January 2, 2000. The contrast between the calm, unassuming demeanor Owens had long projected and the violent acts he now admitted to committing forced a reevaluation of every detail he had provided about Zebb's final movements. Although no new physical evidence emerged directly connecting Owens to Zebb's disappearance, the severity and nature of the crimes he later committed cast an unavoidable shadow over his earlier statements. Detectives who had worked the Quinn case publicly acknowledged that Owens had long been considered a person of interest.
Never charged, never named as a suspect in the legal sense, but consistently positioned at the center of the unresolved timeline simply because he had been the last person known to interact with Zebb before he vanished. With Owens now behind bars for the murders of the Codds, the Asheville Police Department announced more openly that he remained a person of interest in Zebb's case, clarifying that this designation reflected his proximity to the events of that night and the inconsistencies in his early accounts, rather than constituting formal accusatory action. The renewed attention brought additional scrutiny to the anomalies surrounding Owens' actions on the night Zebb disappeared. Investigators revisited his shifting explanations, his reported injuries, his hospital visit, and the fact that he had given multiple versions of the events that occurred after the gas station stop. While the re-examination did not produce new charges or direct evidence, it helped clarify for the public the ongoing role Owens played in the investigative narrative. Law enforcement reiterated that they were bound by evidence, not speculation, and that without physical proof, the case remained officially unsolved. Yet the connection between Owens' later crimes and his involvement in Zebb's final known hours became one of the most widely recognized elements of the case's modern history. The community, too, reacted emotionally to this development. Many who had followed the Quinn case from the beginning described feeling a renewed sense of grief and anger. Grief for the Codds whose lives were taken in such a tragic way, and anger for the lingering uncertainty that continued to cloud Zebb's fate. For Zebb's family, the resurgence of public interest was bittersweet. On one hand, the high-profile nature of the Codd case brought renewed visibility to Zebb's story, encouraging fresh appeals for information and prompting people who had remained silent or perhaps forgotten over the years to reconsider whether they had something to share. On the other hand, the connection to a violent crime served as a painful reminder that the truth about his son's disappearance was still locked away behind unanswered questions. Investigators emphasized that despite Owens' conviction in the Codd case, they had not discovered new evidence definitively linking him to Zebb's disappearance. But the fact that a man so closely tied to Zebb's final night had later committed such horrific acts was enough to reshape the public's understanding of the earlier case. It framed the possibility, carefully and factually, without speculation, that the night of January 2, 2000 may have been more complex, more dangerous, or more significant than anyone understood at the time. The link between the cases also underscored broader investigative challenges, highlighting how a lack of physical evidence can stall even the most thorough inquiry. In the Quinn case, there had been no body, no crime scene, no definitive forensic trail, only a staged car and the last known movements reconstructed through testimony that remain to this day inconsistent. Without those critical anchors, law enforcement could not make declarative statements or pursue charges. And so despite the renewed urgency brought by Owens' later conviction, Zebb's case remained in a painful holding pattern, suspended between suspicion and proof. The connection to the Codd murders ultimately became one of the most important turning points in the timeline of the Quinn investigation, not because it solved the case, but because it reframed it in the public consciousness. It reminded the community, the media, and law enforcement that the unanswered questions surrounding Zebb's disappearance still mattered, that they still demanded attention, and that they still held the weight of a life cut short. In that way, the tragedy of the Codd family did what 15 years of stalled progress had not. It reignited the determination to seek answers for Zebb. And while the legal truth about his fate remained unresolved, the link between these two cases ensured that the silence around his disappearance would never again be as quiet as it once was.
As the years passed and the disappearance of Zebb Quinn drifted from an active investigation into one of Asheville's most haunting cold cases, a renewed push from detectives, fueled in part by improved forensic methods and recurring public interest, led to a meticulous re-examination of every piece of evidence, every witness statement, and every documented movement from the night he vanished, not in hopes of rewriting the case, but in hopes of clarifying it, refining the fragments of truth that had survived the initial investigation and the passage of time. Cold case specialists, many of whom had not been part of the original team, approached the file with fresh eyes and a deliberate focus on verifiable details, sorting the factual components from the noise generated over years of speculation, rumors, and public misunderstandings. Their starting point remained the same as it had been in 2000, the timeline. They revisited time cards from Walmart, reviewed the departure data, watched the available surveillance footage again, and reconstructed the drive to the gas station using updated mapping resources and traffic pattern knowledge. Although the footage was limited,
and the years had eroded some of the clarity around archived data. What remained still grounded the beginning of the story: Zebb leaving work, meeting Robert Jason Owens, and heading south along Hendersonville Road. Then came the critical moment at the gas station. Cold case detectives pored over Owens' statements, comparing them carefully with interviews conducted in the early stages of the investigation. They noted discrepancies that had been documented previously, reaffirming the challenges that had plagued the timeline, particularly around the page Zebb reportedly received and the sudden, uncharacteristic panic Owens claimed to have witnessed. Investigators reanalyzed the phone and pager records using updated digital tools, confirming again that the page traced to an acquaintance was likely sent unintentionally and that no further communication had originated from Zebb's devices after the moment he disappeared. Attention then shifted to the vehicle, the Mazda Protege found abandoned at Mission St. Joseph's Hospital. Every item inside the car was subject to another round of evaluation: the plastic bottle, the hotel keycard, the puppy, and the pink lips drawn on the rear windshield were each examined for forensic potential using modern techniques, though most of these items had already been compromised by time, handling, and exposure. The keycard, which had baffled investigators from the beginning, was checked against a broader pool of hotels, but still offered no match. The bottle was reassessed for latent prints or trace materials, but none that could be considered evidentiary emerged. Even the lipstick-like marking on the rear window was reinterpreted using updated processes, but it remained simply what it had always been: a strange, unexplained symbol without clear origin or connection to any known associate of Zebb. The puppy, long since adopted into a safe home, remained a heartbreaking anomaly, and although investigators reviewed veterinary and shelter records for potential clues, they found no link to Zebb and no known owner connected to the case. Cold case detectives also studied the false workplace call that had been made to Walmart after Zebb disappeared. They re-examined the handwriting that had been flagged as inconsistent with Zebb's style, compared it again with known samples, and reaffirmed the original conclusion: the written note documenting the call did not match Zebb's handwriting. The coworker who placed the call had provided a reason at the time, claiming he had done it as a favor. But the cold case review found no new evidence to either support or contradict his explanation. The voicemail left for Zebb's mother was also reassessed, though by then it existed only in documented form, with no original recording available for advanced audio analysis. Still, investigators reaffirmed the fact that the message did not match Zebb's voice or communication habits, and that it remained one of the earliest signs that someone may have been attempting to obscure his disappearance. The cold case team revisited Owens' hospital records from the night he reported being injured, cross-checking them with the narrative he provided. His explanation had changed multiple times over the initial investigation, and the cold case review documented once again the inconsistencies in his account, including the timing of his reported accident, the extent of his injuries, and the lack of corroborating physical evidence connecting the injuries to any verifiable event. This evaluation, while thorough, could not advance the case beyond the constraints of the original findings. Owens' statements were inconsistent, but inconsistency alone did not constitute proof. Investigators also re-examined broader evidence patterns, possible witnesses who came forward early in the case, reported sightings, unanswered tips, and geographical areas that had been searched in the months following Zebb's disappearance. They compared old maps with new ones, evaluating whether land development, environmental changes, or technological advancements could support additional searches. In some cases, previously inaccessible areas were noted for potential future examination. In others, the cold case team reaffirmed that certain regions had been thoroughly searched and held no physical evidence. Every step of the re-examination reinforced the same central barrier that had loomed over the case since its earliest days: the absence of a body. Without remains, investigators had no crime scene, no cause of death, no trace evidence that could be reanalyzed using improved forensic tools, and no path toward confirming, much less prosecuting, any theory. Despite these limitations, the re-examination process served an important purpose. It ruled out false leads, eliminated lingering conjecture, and reaffirmed the integrity of the original investigation. Most importantly, it clarified that the known facts remained unchanged. Zebb left with Owens, reached the gas station, departed suddenly, and vanished. His car reappeared 2 weeks later
in a staged manner. No financial, digital, or personal activity ever followed. No confirmed sightings ever emerged. And while certain individuals, most notably Owens, remain of interest due to their involvement in the timeline and their later criminal history, nothing uncovered in the re-examination rose to the level of definitive evidence. The case remained open, unresolved, and painfully incomplete. For detectives, this outcome was both a confirmation and a burden, because it underscored the limits of what could be done without new information. For the Quinn family, it was a reminder that even with renewed effort, the heartbreaking silence surrounding Zebb's disappearance still held. And so, even after a comprehensive cold case review, the mystery remained as it had for decades, present, documented, and waiting for the one piece of truth that had yet to surface.
As the years unfolded and the disappearance of Zebb Quinn remained suspended between fragments of fact and a vast, unyielding silence, investigators were compelled to consider various official theories, measured, evidence-based possibilities that might help explain how an 18-year-old with a stable routine and no known conflicts could vanish so completely on an otherwise unremarkable January night. These theories were not conclusions, nor were they rooted in speculation. Instead, they represented structured pathways investigators examined while staying firmly within the boundaries of verifiable information. The first and most prominent theory involved the likelihood of foul play. From the very beginning, detectives recognized that Zebb's sudden and total disappearance, coupled with the staging of his vehicle, the unexplained foreign items left inside it, the false call placed to his workplace, and the absence of any traceable activity afterward, aligned more closely with criminal intervention than voluntary absence. Foul play, in this context, did not point to any particular individual without evidence, but rather to the overarching possibility that another party had acted upon Zebb in a way that prevented him from returning home. This theory was strengthened by the fact that Zebb had no history of running away, no known emotional distress, and no apparent motive to leave his life behind. If something happened to him, investigators reasoned, it likely occurred after he departed the gas station and before his car was staged at the hospital. A second theory examined by law enforcement focused on the staging of the vehicle itself. Detectives treated the unusual placement of items inside the Mazda, including the bottle, the hotel key card, and the puppy, as potential indicators that someone intentionally altered the vehicle to create confusion or mislead the investigation. Staging is not uncommon in cases where individuals attempt to divert suspicion, delay discovery, or construct an alternative narrative of a missing person's actions. In Zebb's case, the deliberate locking of the car, the absence of keys, and the placement of the pink lips symbol on the rear windshield added weight to this angle. Investigators considered whether the staging suggested that the person responsible wanted the car to be found in a public space, but not in a condition that would provide clarity. Instead, the car offered contradiction and uncertainty, objects that had no relevance to Zebb and that investigators could not link to any known individual. While this did not allow detectives to identify the perpetrator or the motive, it reinforced the view that the car did not end up at the hospital by accident. Someone placed it there deliberately. A third theory explored the involvement of persons of interest, though investigators remained clear that none of these individuals had been charged or named as suspects in a legal sense. The primary person of interest remained Robert Jason Owens, due to being the last confirmed individual to see Zebb and due to inconsistencies documented in his early statements. Investigators also examined the coworker who made the false call to Walmart, though no evidence tied him to criminal behavior. Other individuals who surfaced through tips, associations, or community rumors were interviewed as well, but none produced verifiable leads. Within this theory, investigators considered whether any individual in Zebb's orbit might have had undisclosed motivations or conflicts, financial, personal, or interpersonal, that were not initially evident. But despite extensive interviews, background checks, and cross-referencing of alibis, no scenario involving a specific person was supported by the physical evidence required to move forward. Law enforcement made it clear over the years that suspicion alone could not form the basis of legal action.
reiterating that while some individuals' actions were unusual or inconsistent, no definitive proof tied them directly to Zebb's disappearance. Another theory evaluated by detectives, though consistently approached with caution, was the possibility of an accidental event occurring after Zebb left the gas station, something that could have caused him to crash, become incapacitated, or otherwise left vulnerable. However, this theory weakened significantly in the face of hard physical realities. Extensive searches along potential routes revealed no evidence of a crash, skid marks, vehicle debris, or signs of a roadside emergency. Moreover, the fact that Zebb's car reappeared 2 weeks later in a condition indicative of controlled relocation, complete with staged elements, contradicted the idea of an unrecovered accident. If Zebb had crashed or wandered away from his vehicle, someone would still have had to retrieve the Mazda, transport it to the hospital, and place objects inside it, all actions that implied deliberate human involvement rather than an accidental circumstance. For this reason, while thoroughly considered, the accidental theory lane could not account for the full scope of known facts. A final investigatory angle involved the question of whether Zebb could have left on his own, even temporarily, before encountering harm. This possibility was largely dismissed early, not because investigators ruled out any voluntary movement, but because there was simply no evidence to support sustained voluntary absence. Zebb left behind money, personal items, his job, his plans, and most importantly, his connection to his mother, with whom he had a close and communicative relationship. His bank account saw no activity. His social security number remained unused. His belongings showed no signs of preparation for travel. Nothing in his life reflected an intent to disappear or start over, and the voicemail and workplace call suggested external interference rather than independent action. Investigators acknowledged that a voluntary departure followed by an external event could theoretically occur, but found no factual support for it. Across all these theories, one truth remained constant. Nothing could be stated with certainty. The case lacked the definitive evidence required to confirm a theory, name a suspect, or reconstruct the full sequence of events that unfolded after Zebb drove away from the gas station. Instead, investigators were left with parallel possibilities, each grounded in fact but incomplete, each supported by elements of evidence but never fully conclusive. This absence of resolution became the defining characteristic of the case. Theories existed, meticulously documented and explored, but none carried the weight needed to transform possibility into truth. And as investigators repeatedly emphasized, until new information emerged, until someone came forward or new evidence surfaced, Zebb's disappearance would remain suspended in that painful, uncertain space between what is known and what cannot yet be proven.
For Zebb Quinn's family, especially his mother Denise, the years following his disappearance have been defined not only by grief, but by an unyielding, deeply human determination to keep his memory alive and to push relentlessly for answers in a case that offered none. From the moment she realized her son had not returned home on the night of January 2nd, 2000, Denise stepped into a reality that no parent ever imagines, a life suspended between hope and heartbreak, between believing her son would walk back through the door and knowing that each passing hour made that possibility less likely. In those early days, she contacted friends, coworkers, and relatives, retracing every possible path he might have taken, clinging to the belief that he might simply have been delayed or stranded. But as the truth set in, that her gentle, responsible, dependable son had vanished without explanation, Denise's focus shifted from momentary fear to enduring resolve. She became the driving force behind the entire search effort, ensuring that Zebb's name never faded from public consciousness and that investigators never stopped feeling the weight of his absence. Over the years, she remained at the center of every interview, every press inquiry, every community outreach effort, speaking about her son with a quiet, unwavering strength that anchored the case even when leads ran dry and public attention waned. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, Denise attended meetings with detectives, reviewed updates, and worked tirelessly to support any effort that might bring clarity to what had happened to her son. She learned to navigate the slow, emotionally grueling pace of a long-term missing person investigation, where each new piece of information could bring either fleeting relief or crushing disappointment. Her commitment to seeking truth drew the attention of neighbors, friends, and even strangers who saw in her persistence a reflection of a mother's love that refused to be dimmed by uncertainty. Community vigils were organized, often led or attended by those who had never personally known Zebb but felt the impact of his disappearance as though he were part of their own Asheville family. Candlelight gatherings, prayer circles, and remembrance events became quiet rituals that helped sustain the Quinn family through stretches of time when the investigation seemed to stall. At some vigils, attendees shared stories of Zebb from school, work, or childhood, brief but heartfelt recollections that painted a vivid portrait of who he had been. A kind-hearted young man whose absence was felt like a wound across the community. For years, Denise and her family maintained communication with law enforcement, checking for updates, asking questions, and remaining fully cooperative even when the case entered long periods of stagnation. Every new detective assigned to the file found in her a powerful advocate for her son, someone who understood the case facts but also needed to know that her son's story mattered, that he had not simply disappeared into a forgotten chapter of local history. Through media interviews, she reiterated the same message. Zebb was not the type of young man who would walk away from his life, and someone, somewhere, knew something. That message resonated not only with Asheville residents, but with viewers and readers across the country who encountered the case through news specials, print articles, and later, online discussions. Despite the emotional toll, Denise refused to let her family's search be overshadowed by frustration. Instead, she channeled her grief into advocacy, urging people who might have information to come forward, no matter how small or delayed. As the years passed, she worked with organizations dedicated to missing children and young adults, connecting with other families going through similar anguish and offering support grounded in shared experience. She kept photographs of Zebb accessible, maintained his belongings with care, and continued marking birthdays and milestones, moments that carried both celebration and sorrow. Each passing year deepened the reality that she might never receive a definitive answer, but it never dimmed her commitment to finding one. Community support remained strong as well. People who had gone to school with Zebb continued to share his story. Local residents who remembered the initial search and the discovery of the staged car urged newer generations to learn about the case. Even those without personal ties to the Quinn family recognized the injustice of an unresolved disappearance and joined the mission to keep Zebb's name from fading. Over time, digital platforms amplified these efforts, allowing Zebb's story to reach an even wider audience. Online communities, true crime forums, social media groups, and local advocacy networks all contributed to ongoing awareness. Each anniversary of Zebb's disappearance sparked renewed calls for information, with supporters reminding the public that the case was not forgotten and that closure for the family remained desperately needed. But for the Quinn family, the emotional landscape of this fight was far more personal and deeply layered. Every holiday, every family gathering, every quiet moment held the echo of Zebb's absence. Denise often spoke of the simple, everyday things she missed most: the sound of her son's voice, his kindness, his gentle presence in the household, the future he was working towards before that winter night. These reflections became an integral part of the way she honored his memory, ensuring that Zebb remained not a headline or a statistic, but a living, cherished part of their family's story. Yet the lack of answers, the absence of a resolution, a location, a why, remained a constant source of pain. Families of missing persons often describe this as ambiguous loss, a state in which the mind oscillates endlessly between hope and mourning, never able to rest in either. For Denise, that uncertainty became her burden and her motivation. Even as investigators reiterated that the case remained open and active, the passage of time created new challenges. People moved away, memories faded, individuals who might have known something became harder to reach. But through it all, the Quinn family never stopped fighting. They continued to speak his name, to share his photographs, to stand up at community events, and to remind Asheville that behind every cold case file is a human life and a grieving family waiting for truth. In the end, the family's devotion, marked by persistence, courage, and love, became one of the most powerful forces keeping the case alive. Their fight for answers was not just an effort to solve a mystery, but an effort to honor a son whose life mattered, whose kindness touched those around him, and whose absence left a space that no time or distance could ever fill.
The disappearance of Zebb Quinn endures as one of North Carolina's most bewildering and heartbreaking unsolved mysteries, a case that continues to cast a long shadow over Asheville, shaping not only the community's memory, but also its understanding of vulnerability, justice, and the fragile boundaries between the ordinary and the unthinkable. In the decades since that cold January night in 2000, Zebb's story has become more than a case file. It has become a reminder of how quickly and irrevocably a life can be altered, how a single unexplained moment can fracture time and leave an entire network of loved ones navigating the hollow space where certainty once lived. His absence is not simply the absence of a person, it is the absence of answers, of closure, of the narrative that every family hopes will eventually emerge to explain the unexplainable. For the people of Asheville, the memory of Zebb's disappearance lingers in the quiet corners of the city, in the Walmart where he worked, in the gas station that marked his last confirmed sighting, in the hospital parking lot where his car was discovered in its chillingly staged state. These locations, now woven into the fabric of local history, stand as physical reminders of a night that slipped out of the realm of routine and into the realm of the unresolved. Residents who lived in Asheville at the time often recall the shock and unease that settled over the community as the details emerged. The abrupt departure from the gas station, the incoherent voicemail, the false workplace call, and the inexplicable items found in the car. This sense of collective bewilderment ultimately evolved into a long-term awareness, an understanding that answers do not always come quickly, that justice is not always swift, and that some mysteries defy even decades of investigation. For the Quinn family, the legacy of Zebb's disappearance has been written not in conclusions but in endurance. Their steadfast commitment to pursuing truth, even in the face of silence, has transformed their grief into a quiet form of activism, one that continually urges the public to remember Zebb as more than the unsolved circumstances of his final night. They speak of him as he truly was, a kind, soft-spoken teenager with gentle ambitions and a future he was ready to build. In doing so, they ensure that his identity remains anchored in life rather than mystery. Their courage in navigating the uncertain space between hope and sorrow has inspired countless others who face similar limbo, reinforcing the notion that a loved one can disappear from sight but never from memory. As years passed and as cold case detectives revisited the evidence with fresh eyes, the Quinn family remained a grounding force, an unyielding reminder that behind every unanswered question is a human story that deserves resolution. And though the re-examination did not yield definitive breakthroughs, it reaffirmed the importance of continuing the search, of holding space for the possibility that closure may still come even after decades. Within law enforcement, Zebb's case continues to serve as a stark example of the complexities inherent in missing person investigations, especially those that lack a crime scene, physical remains, or witnesses capable of providing consistent accounts. It underscores the necessity of quick action, of preserving even the smallest pieces of evidence, and of revisiting cold cases with new technologies as they emerge. Detectives who have worked the case over the years have spoken of its weight, the burden of wanting to deliver answers to a family that has waited so long, the frustration of encountering dead ends despite exhaustive effort, and the lingering sense of responsibility that never fully fades. For newer investigators, the case stands as a reminder of the importance of persistence and the reality that some of the most important clues in unsolved cases may come not from evidence, but from individuals who, years later, decide to speak. In the broader true crime community, the disappearance of Zebb Quinn has become an enduring point of discussion, a case often cited for its unusual blend of confirmed details, unexplained anomalies, and lack of resolution. Documentaries, podcasts, articles, and online forums continue to revisit the timeline, examining the facts with respectful caution, always acknowledging that the mystery lies not in speculation, but in the gaps that remain between what is known and what is missing. These retellings keep Zebb's story alive for new audiences, ensuring that the questions surrounding his disappearance continue to echo beyond Asheville. Through each retelling, the central truth remains constant. An 18-year-old disappeared under deeply unusual circumstances, and the answers to what happened have yet to fully emerge. But perhaps the most profound element of Zebb's legacy is the way his story reflects the fragile threads that connect lives. The way a single unexplained moment can ripple across decades, altering families, communities, and investigative trajectories. The night he vanished was not a night marked by danger or chaos. It was a quiet Sunday evening, shaped by routine plans and ordinary expectations. And yet from that ordinary beginning grew a mystery that has never loosened its grip on those who remember it. The unanswered night of January 2nd, 2000 remains suspended in time, untouched, unresolved, and unforgotten. In reflecting on Zebb's story, the community carries forward not only the memory of an unsolved disappearance, but the reminder of their shared responsibility to honor the lives of those who are missing. His case stands as a call to vigilance, empathy, and persistence, urging all who hear it to look closer, to speak if they know something, and to recognize the enduring importance of seeking truth. And as long as his story remains in the public consciousness, there remains hope. Hope that one day a new lead will emerge, that someone will remember a detail they once overlooked, that a long-held silence will break, and that the answers Zebb's family has sought for so many years will finally come to light. Share this story. Keep his name alive, because someone, somewhere, remembers what happened on the night Zebb Quinn disappeared.